One of the key skills you can develop as a programmer is how to test and debug your code. And having a good debugger integrated into your development environment and knowing how to use it is a big step towards developing those skills. So I'm going to look at how to debug Python code using the debugger that's built into PyCharm. And I put together a fairly simple program that has a lot of bugs in it. And there are three different kinds or categories of bugs. So the first type of bug you can run into is called a syntax error. And that's when I've written code that doesn't actually follow the grammar rules of the programming language that I'm developing in. So I have a number of syntax errors in this code, and many of them are flagged automatically by Python using syntax highlighting. So particularly red squiggly lines underneath bits of code are an indicator that I've violated one or more rules of grammar in the programming language. Doesn't actually tell me what I've done wrong. If I hover over it, it might though. So for example, if I hover over this, it says unresolved reference, calculate amps. And if I hover over that, it says comma or close parenthesis expected. If I hover over this, it says end of statement expected, and so on. So it is giving me a clue. Voltage is unresolved, and open paren or colon is expected there, and so on. You can work through these, and usually you can tell what's wrong. So if voltage is unresolved, that means that there's no variable called voltage that's defined in this function. I need to either pass in a parameter named voltage, or I need to have a local variable named voltage, and I don't. I have something called volts, and that doesn't match what I have in voltage. So based on the syntax highlighting alone, I know that the correction is to rename that variable so that it matches that. Now here, calculate amps, that's two words, but I meant to have one name with an underscore. And then here at the end of this line, it's expecting a colon. So I'm missing a colon. Here's a variable called ohms, which is unresolved, but this time the problem is I've misspelled it as a parameter. And then scrolling down a little bit, I have watts, but I haven't passed watts into this function. So let's go ahead and add a watts parameter. And then I have a problem here, amps. This is just a variable, and this is a piece of text. So I need to concatenate that in, or put a comma there, one or the other. Either one will work. But I'm using concatenation there, so let's go ahead and concatenate that in and put a space. And that seems to be everything that's getting syntax highlighted by Python. So it's a good chance that I fixed all my syntax errors. So let's try running the program and see if it runs. Okay, so it ran. It didn't produce any errors, but it didn't produce any output either. And that's a logical problem. So the second kind of error that you can get is a logical problem. The program is syntactically, grammatically correct, but logically it doesn't do what we want to do. And the thing that it's missing, first of all, is I'm defining a bunch of functions, but I'm not actually running any of them anywhere. So I have this main function which serves as a driver for my program, and it goes through each of the functions in turn, but I'm not actually calling that to run it. And what you'll usually see, you'll see this in the template for a new project you create, or you can do it manually. You'll see something like if under name equal under main, then you'll usually call your driver program. Okay, so what is this actually doing here? That should be under. So what this is doing is this parameter, this global variable called undername is going to be set to different values depending on how you load this Python file. So let's go ahead and see, for example, I'm going to not run main just for a second, but I'm going to print undername. And now, so all my code is doing when I run it now is going to define a bunch of functions, but then it's only going to print the value of that variable. And if I run this from the console, so let me exit from my REPL loop, and I'm going to execute my main.py. I see that the value of undername prints as undermain. So that Python, when you run it directly as a top-level script, it gets run with name set to undermain, and that's how you know it's being run as a top-level script. On the other hand, if this thing gets imported into some other file, so for example, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. I'm going to import actually just main. And then here, I'm going to not do anything. I'll just say print hello world. Actually, when I run this, it's not going to execute. It's not going to print undername at all. So it just prints hello world. This code in here doesn't get executed because undername is not equal to undermain. If I want to see what it is, let's go ahead and pass like so. So now, if I run this from the command line, it'll print undermain again because it always prints undermain when it gets loaded. Here, when I execute this, I see it's main, but not undermain. So it's actually named as the module I imported it as. And so if I go ahead and rename this file, so I'm going to refactor. Actually, I have to do that from the file. So I'm going to right click on that and refactor, rename some other module name. So I rename that to some other module name. If I run it now, it gets imported as some other module name. So whatever name that I give here, that's the value that undername is going to get when it's imported. But if it's run from the command line, it's going to be set to undermain. So that's how you can have some code that gets run when you run this as a standalone script, but it doesn't get run if you import it. When you import it, it just does all the function definitions. And if I had any constants, global constants, those would get defined as well. But it doesn't run the code inside of here. So let's go ahead and only run main if we're running the script as top level. And now it prints, actually I have to right click on that and run it. So it's running now and it's getting my input. So I say, what is the resistance in ohms? Let's say 0.5 ohms. And what is the voltage in volts? Let's say 4.2 volts. And then I get the third type of error, which is a runtime exception. So a runtime exception is when you execute a piece of code that's grammatically correct, but it causes some sort of exception in processing, and the program crashes as a result. And what it's showing me in the console is called a stack backtrace, or a traceback. And so I can actually click on any of these links, and it shows me the position in the code where I'm at. So the most recent part in the code that I'm at is actually the thing that's at the bottom of the stack here. So right here is where I actually got the error. On this line of code, I got an error, can't multiply sequence by non-int of type string. So this thing right here thinks I'm multiplying a sequence by something that is a string. And strings are actually sequences as well. If I'm not sure why that's happening, I can put a breakpoint on the line of code by clicking on the gray gutter next to the line, and then running it under the debugger by clicking on this little bug icon. So the run configuration is set to some other module name. I click on the bug icon, and it's going to run until it hits the breakpoint. So just like before, it's asking me for the resistance in ohms and the voltage. But here, when it gets to the line, it doesn't execute it. It stops before it executes the line. And it shows me in this variables pane what the value of all the variables inside this scope are. So inside of calculate watts, I'm passing in volts and amps. It shows me the values of those two things. And you'll notice they're both strings. So I'm passing strings into calculate watts. And I might wonder, well, okay, why am I passing strings in? Where are these strings coming from? This part here, this is the stack backtrace. So it's showing me the frames that led to me being inside of this function calculate watts. So here I am in calculate watts. If I click here, this shows me where I called calculate watts, and I see that I'm passing in volts and ohms. And it also shows me in this variable pane that ohms is the string 4.2 and volts is the string 0.5. And then if I want to know where that came from, I can look at main and I can see that volts and ohms are being returned by get inputs. So I can also do this. If I put a breakpoint here, and then I'm going to rerun the program from there. And now you'll notice that I'm stopped at this breakpoint before this line of code has been executed. So I can step into get inputs and execute it one line at a time by clicking on this little arrow button that says step into. So let's step into that. That shows me what happens when I call get inputs. It's executing this input statement, and I'm going to step over that, which means execute it and then go to the next line of code when you're done. So we'll execute that. Now it's actually sitting and waiting in the console for me to answer this question. So what is the resistance in ohms? 0.5. And then you see it goes to the next line. And if we look back in the debugger tab, we see that we now have a variable called ohms that's bound to the string 0.5. But we actually want this to be a floating point number. And so this is a logical error that basically led to us getting a runtime exception later on. So the logical error is we're taking this as a string when we wanted to take it as a decimal number. And that causes a runtime error later on when we try to multiply two strings together. So I'm going to stop the program from running by clicking the little stop box here. And I'm going to fix my code by wrapping both of those inputs in a call to float. So this is going to take the string that's returned by input, whatever the user typed, and it's going to call the float function on that string and return a floating point number which gets stored in ohms and volts. And now if I run it under the debugger, so I've gotten up to this line of code. I'm going to step over that. And it's waiting in the console. I type 0.5 for ohms, and I type 4.2 for volts. Now I'm on the next line of code. I can go back to the debugger pane, and I can see that ohms is now a floating point number 4.2, and volts is a floating point number 0.5. So this is an improvement because before I had strings and now I have floats. But I have another problem here, which is I actually entered 0.5 for ohms and 4.2 volts for 4.2 volts for volts. But I ended up with 4.2 ohms and 0.5 volts. So what I need to do here is look at the return values from get inputs. This is another logic error. I need to look at the return values from get inputs and match them to these two variables in the assignment statement. So if I look at get inputs, I see that get inputs is returning ohms and volts. What is the resistance in ohms? That gets stored in ohms. What is the voltage in volts? That gets stored as volts. That's correct. And then I'm returning ohms comma volts here. But on the other side, in this assignment statement, I'm setting volts comma ohms to this thing. So the order here has to match. Now I'm using volts comma ohms in the rest of this function, so I'm going to stick with that here. And that means to make them match, I need to change the order of the return values here and get inputs. Okay, and I did that by stepping into this function and seeing what values were getting returned, and then stepping over that call and seeing what values I got in my main function. So let's go ahead and run it again. And now I'm going to step over that line. I have to type in 0.5 here and 4.2. And then if I go back to the debugger pane, I see that ohms is 0.5 as a float, which is correct, and volt is 4.2. And then now I can step into calculate watts. Watts is equal to volts times amps, so let's return that. But I see that now I'm getting none for watts. And so let's look at what's going on in that calculation. So I already have a breakpoint here. So let me just rerun it up to that breakpoint. And I'm going to take this breakpoint off. And then I'm going to resume. So that little thing was resume. And then on 0.5, 4.2, and now it stopped where I'm calculating watts and I'm multiplying volts times amps. So let's look at the debugger. So volts is 4.2, amps is 0.5, and that's not actually correct because 0.5 is actually my ohms. So I want to look at where I called this. So I click on that stack frame in main to see where I called it. And I see I'm passing in volts and ohms here, but I'm receiving them as volts and amps. So I'm actually not passing in the right value for this parameter. And in fact, I don't really have amps yet because I'm calculating amps in the next line. So in order to fix this logical error, I actually have to switch the order of these two operations. So first I calculate amps, and then I pass amps into calculating watts, and then I should be okay. So let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here and see how we're doing. So I'm going to rerun the whole thing. Okay, 0.5, 4.2, and then amps is 0.119. and volts is 4.2. So let's go ahead and continue. And then let's look at what we have. So volts is 4.2, ohms is 0.5, amps is 0.2, which actually seems too low for me. So it seems like the calculation of amps is not actually correct. Should be 8 amps, 8.4 amps, which to debug logical errors, you actually have to know what the right answer is. And so it's best to make sure that you thoroughly understand whatever math you're using in your program before you try to debug it, because otherwise you aren't going to recognize that the results are incorrect or not. But here I'm actually expecting a 8.4 amps, and I got 0.119 amps instead. So let's try to figure out why that's happening. So I'm calling calculate watts and getting the wrong result. So let's put a breakpoint actually back where we're doing calculate watts. And we see calculate watts is multiplying volts times amps. It's amps that's wrong actually. So let's look at where we're calculating amps. So that's going to be here. I'm passing in volts and ohms into calculate amps. So calculate amps is dividing volts by ohms, which looks like the correct calculation. So I'm going to put a breakpoint there and rerun it. Okay, 0.5 and 4.2. So this is the right calculation, but if I look at the values that are getting passed in, I see ohms is 4.2 and volts is 0.5. So I'm doing the right calculation, but I passed in the parameters in the wrong order again. So down here in main, I passed in volts and ohms, but up here in calculate amps, I'm getting ohms and volts, which is backwards. So once again, to fix that, I have to change the order of the parameters to match. Okay. And then I might have missed that completely if I didn't know the correct value for amps. So let's go ahead and rerun it again. And we'll do 0.5 and 4.2. So now we're in calculate watts and we're multiplying volts times amps. But amps is actually the correct value. It's what I expected, 8.4, and volts is 4.2. So watts is going to be like somewhere between 30 and 40. So I'm going to step over. That returns me to where I called calculate watts and step over. And actually watts is still none. So let's look at what value I'm returning from calculate watts after I calculate it. And I see that it's none because I'm not returning any value at all. So once again, this is a logical error because calculate watts is not returning a value. So I'm getting none for watts. So to fix that, I need to return watts. So let's go ahead and run it again. 0.5, 4.2. So now I'm up to output results. Amps is 8.4, which is correct. Ohms is 0.5, which is correct. Volts is 4.2, which is correct. And then watts is 35.28, which is about what I was expecting. Somewhere between 30 and 40, and it ended up being 35. So now I can step over output results and see if I get the right output. So step over, and actually I got an error in output results. So unsupported operand type for plus, float, and stir. So once again, I got a runtime exception here because the types of these parameters was wrong. Basically, you can't add numbers to strings in Python. You can add strings to strings, and you can add numbers to numbers, but you can't add numbers to strings. So what you need to do to make this work is either wrap stir around all of these numbers, so that converts ohms to a string and then concatenates it. And then do the same thing here. So this is one solution. Or another solution that you can use is to use comma separated list of values like that. And then that will insert a space by default as the separator between each of the things in the list. So that's another solution. Or a third solution is to use formatted strings, which we're going to be talking about soon. So that should fix the runtime error. And then the other thing that I want to check is make sure that the order of the arguments here matches, actually the order of the parameters here matches the order of the arguments in the call. And I can already see that they don't because this is ohms volts again, and my main function has volts ohms. So volts, ohms, amps, watts. And the only other way I could have noticed that is by actually looking at the output and seeing that it was incorrect. So let's go ahead and run the whole thing again, see what I got. So 0.5 and 4.2. And then I have a breakpoint here, which I'm going to remove by clicking on it. And then I'm going to hit the resume button, go back to the console, and I see my output. So 0.5 ohms at 4.2 volts is 8.4 amps. That's 35.28 watts. So that's all correct. Now I'm just going to run it straight, not under the debugger. 0.5 ohms, 4.2 volts, and I get my output, which looks correct. So this is the kind of thing that you develop skill with over time by practicing, and you will get plenty of practice debugging your code.